There were no obligations upon the Jewish people other than to learn. Their food was taken care of, the Anei Kavod would clean their clothing. They had nothing to do other than learn. They were in the yeshiva, but you have to appreciate the yeshiva that they were in. In the center of the machanos, if you had all the machanos surrounding, in the center was Machane Leviah. The Levium were the Torah teachers. In the center there was the Mishkan, and daily you would see Hashem. You would see the Anan, you would see the pillar. At night it shined brilliantly bright, and you would see Moshe Rabbeinu go in. The Shekhinah was present. And you had in those days the greatest Torah teacher ever in the history of the Jewish people, Moshe Rabbeinu himself. So if you're living in a virtual yeshiva, where everything that you're exposed to from the time you're born is learning, learning, and learning, the Shekhinah is right there, and there are zero distractions, far less than there were for a boy in Europe. What type of level were these people on? It's hard to imagine how much they had mastered, how much they accomplished, and it wasn't just a few people. The entire generation. They were born in the Midbar, grew up in the Midbar, spent decade after decade learning and learning, growing and growing, and by the time they entered Eretz Yisrael, they were giants, albeit not physical giants, but giants of the spirit. And yet the Siforno is telling us that they did not compare to the generation earlier that had been at Har Sinai. That makes no sense. The generation that were at Har Sinai were born and brought up in Mitzrayim. They barely had a moment to learn, and they certainly didn't have a Kabbalah Torah. There was nothing in Mitzrayim other than the 49 levels of Tumah. They had 1 year where they saw the Makkahs, a brief experience being taken into the Midbar. Granted, they had Kabbalah Torah. Granted, they were at Har Sinai, but it was one experience. And yet, the Siforno is saying at that moment, they were so much above. Each person was such a unique individual that they should be counted by name. The next generation was nowhere near their level. And the problem is, it sounds very, very difficult to understand. It sounds the opposite of what should be intuitive. And I'd like to see if we could better understand this Siforno and understand what he's telling us. And to do that, let me share with you an interesting thought. Chazal tell us that one of the things that is beyond human understanding is the din. When I leave this earth, I will stand in front of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and Hashem will review my days, my weeks, my months, and that judgment is beyond human comprehension. Okay, I'd like to ask the following question. Why is it beyond human comprehension? What's so hard? All you got to do is count up the mitzvahs, count up your averos, and you know what you're holding. And if you tell me, well, I'm not so good at counting, I'll solve your problem. The Shmuz app is now on Android, and it's on the Apple Store. To develop it, I had to spend some time looking at apps, looking at what apps could do, what they couldn't do. I had to tell the developer what features I want. So I spent some time studying apps. There are apps for everything now. You want to find a minion? There's a minion app. You want to find a kosher restaurant? There's a kosher. There are apps for everything. So I have a simple solution. You design an app. Every mitzvah clicks a mitzvah. Every avera clicks an avera. What's so difficult to add up all of your mitzvahs, add up all your averas, put a little app on your smartphone, count it up, and you'll know exactly what you're holding? Why is the din so beyond human comprehension? And the reason why din is so much beyond human comprehension is because the judgment in Shemayim is nothing like judgment in our world. And I'll explain to you what I mean. Imagine you have two people. We'll call one David and one Moshe. David grows up the rich kid in class, and Moshe grows up the poor guy. Well, as they go on in life, David's always got it great. He's always living the life of Riley. He's got the designer shoes when he's a little kid. His bar mitzvah is on the yacht. And everything is perfect for him. Moshe has it pretty rough. Moshe has tattered clothing, tattered shoes. Moshe's bar mitzvah is in the back of a shtivel somewhere. And throughout his life, Moshe's suffering because the great, great wealthy David has it wonderfully and he has it rough. Okay. They grow up, things for David turned very well. He inherits his father's business, doing phenomenally well. Things that Moshe is not doing so well at all. He barely can scratch out a living. He's having a rough time. And one day he shows up in the office of his old school chum Moshe and asks for a job. David flatly refuses, at which point he pulls out a gun and shoots him down dead. Ritzicha, murder. Moshe killed David. Simple. What if the Tohen, what if the defending lawyer said to the judge, Your Honor, you have to understand there were hugely extenuating circumstances. Do you know the jealousy that he suffered from the time that he's a little boy? And he had to suffer with the fact that this other fellow made so much money. And from the time that he came of any understanding, he was constantly jealous, constantly in the shadow. And then when he gets married and has kids, he can't even pay the bills. And begging mercy, he goes into the man's office and he says, Please give me a job. And from behind his desk, David looks at him and says, You loser. Remember back at the bar mitzvah when I was on the yacht? Remember when you were a little kid in the courtyard, you were wearing tattered shoes and I was wearing sneakers? You're a loser. You always were a loser. You'll always be a loser. Your Honor, he lost it. He lost control. He shot him. You have to forgive him. What would you say? You'd say that the fellow who said those words is a creep, a nasty creep, but that doesn't exonerate, it doesn't pater the guy who killed him. There's only one question that Beis Din Shalmata asks. Were you aware of what you were doing? Were you mazed? Were you intentional? If you were, you're chayiv misa. There are no extenuating circumstances. There's no considerations. If it was easy, if it was hard, doesn't matter. Did you kill him? Were you aware? Yes or no? And if yes, you're chayiv misa. And that's din in our world. And din in our world is very simple. Were you alert? Were you aware? But din in Shemayim doesn't quite work that way. And din in Shemayim has a whole different depth to it and many, many levels. And I want to give you an example. And I'm going to use different names now so I can remember the names. We have Ruvain and we have Shimon. Reuven and Shimon are very, very reliable and very dependable. Every single day they're both at the Daf Yomi. But not only are they both at the Daf Yomi, every single day both of them prepare for 2 hours. They prepare for 2 hours and both of them show up to the Daf Yomi religiously day after day for 7 years. Now, when we look at it, what we see is about the same place. Both of them are holding in the same place. After all, both of them prepare for 2 hours, both of them show up, both of them learn. Except one little problem. One of them gives the daf, and the other one sits in the daf Yomi Shir. Reuven, who gives the daf Yomi Shir, is brilliant. His mind is clear and incisive, and his understanding is precise. And after 7 years, he mastered Shas. Shimon, who attends the Shir, kind of his mind isn't that sharp. His grasp certainly isn't there. And as a result, he knows something, but very, very little. Their knowledge can't be compared. But there's way more. You see, Reuven's clarity is so precise that he attracts a crowd. Everyone comes to his shir to hear the clarity of his shir. As a matter of fact, it's the largest shir in Brooklyn. 150 guys come every morning, most of whom wouldn't even come to Daf Yomi Shir, but they come for him. And Chazal tell us that anything that you accomplish, it's not just you, but anyone that you bring along, their schusim come over to you. So what that means is it's not just Reuven's personal learning, 150 men along with him. Shimon is a good guy, he's trying, but it's him alone, and Reuven carries a crowd with him. He's mastered Shas, he knows it backwards and forward, and he brought an entire group of people together with him. There's no basis of comparison between Reuven and Shimon. But the din in Shemayim doesn't stop there. The din in Shemayim is far more complex and far more deep. And I'll explain to you what I mean. I sometimes, more often than I'm able to answer, I get phone calls. And sometimes you can tell by the nature of the voicemail, the level of seriousness. I got a call before Shmuz. I got a call from a woman, and it was clearly a serious issue. but I really couldn't call back. I tried to call back as promptly as I can. I didn't have time. We went away for Shmuz. The kids were in the car, and I knew based on the type of shaila it was that it would take at least an hour, and I could not call her back. She called a second time, a third time, and right after Shmuz, much as Shmuz, she called. It was the fourth time, and I felt horrible. I felt terrible, but I just didn't have the time to call her back. And Monday morning, I said, no matter what, I'm stopping learning. I must call this woman back. It's pashut, not nice. And you have to appreciate that when I got on the phone, I felt a little guilty to begin with. And I called up and I said, hi, it's Rabbi Schaefer. I'm sorry I couldn't call till now. How could I help you? And this was the response. Now you call. Now you call. And I'm saying to myself, oh my goodness. Call me back in 7 days. Hamevin Yovin. And she hangs up the phone. I said to myself, listen, lady, I'm not being paid for this. All right, I should have called you back earlier. But it really not nice. Would you pay me back in the coma? I waited 4 days, you pay me back 7 days. But there was something about the way she said it that troubled me. Call me back in 7 days, Hamevin Yovin. I don't know why, but I asked my wife if she recognized the name. I told her the name. My wife said, yeah, I recognize the name. I said, do you know her? My wife said, yeah, I know her very well. As a matter of fact, I don't know if you know, but her husband just died, and the Levaya is today at 1 o'clock. I called her back at 11 o'clock in the morning. I called her when she was on the way to her husband's funeral. 11 o'clock, I called her. She was on the way to her husband's funeral, and she said the words, now you call back? Call me back in 7 days after the Shiva, Hamevin Yovin. One who understands will understand. And what I learned from that is a very interesting lesson. We think we know. I had her pegged exactly. She was giving me, do justice. I delayed her. She's going to pay me back by delaying calling me back. And I had her pegged 100% wrong. And the reality is that we human beings never get it. I think I know. I think I have each person pegged exactly where they are, and we don't have a clue. Rasul Salant in his Igeris tells us that when Chazal tell us l'fum tsara agra, in accordance to the effort, in accordance to the pain is the reward, he says there are thousands of degrees of difference. You could be learning an hour, and one day your mind is clear and it's easy, and another time you could be learning the same hour, but it's difficult, you're foggy, and you're troubled, and you force yourself to pay attention. He says there could be thousands of degrees of difference in the reward of one act to the other, because one was under duress, one was with tremendous tsar, and the other one wasn't. And one of the cheshbonos that go into counting in Shemayim is how easy or how difficult, and where were you? Where were you holding? And where were you at life? And what did this mean to you? And there could be thousands of degrees of difference. One act could be worth 1,000 other acts, and one act could be worth 5,000 acts, because it depends on how difficult or how easy. And the Din in Shemayim really gets even more complex, because it's not only how easy or how difficult, but there are many other factors. I'll give you one more that may be obvious. Imagine, and this may take a little bit of imagination over here, but imagine that I have a good voice. And imagine that I dam for the Amud, and people flock. People come to hear me far and wide to hear my rendition, my beautiful Nisan Tokef. And from the moment I put on that talis, all I'm thinking about is the beauty of my voice, how it carries, and how it echoes, and how melodious it is. What a wonderful, beautiful chazan I am. How lishma, how pure is my davening. It's not l'shem shemayim, it's l'shem me. My voice, my reputation, I want the world to hear my melodic, beautiful voice. That act is thousands of degrees different than a man who's pure of heart, who's talking to his Creator, and who's davening with one thing in mind, serving Hashem, maybe being ma'orer, awakening in others through my voice. But the difference between those acts could have thousands of degrees of difference. The Aruch HaTzaddikim says that the difference between a humble man's act and a arrogant man's act can be literally thousands of times the difference. And one blot Gemara learned with humility could be the equivalent of 1,000 or 2,000 blot learned with arrogance. And those are the words of the Orchas Tzadikim. They're not my words, not my concept. And the din in Shemayim is even more complex, because it's not just how difficult it is, and it's not just how lishma, how pure your act is. There's a whole other dimension to judgment in Shemayim that we're not usually attuned to. And I'll share with you what that is. The Mishnah in Avos tells us that there were 10 generations from Noach till Avram. And each one of those generations were evil. Each one of those generations got Hashem angry, Kaviyachol. Not only didn't Hashem have nachas, if it could be Hashem got angry, whatever that means, the point is, amongst every member of those generations, they were wicked, one after another. And then the Mishnah says, until Avram Avinu came, and hitil schar, he took the reward of all of them. And if you look in the Mefarshim, you look in Rabbeinu Yonah on the Mishnah in Avos, Rabbeinu Yonah explains. He says that when Hashem creates each Jew, Hashem creates for that person a portion in Gan Eden and a portion in Gehenna. In those 10 generations, there wasn't a man who earned his portion. Came along Avram and collected every generation, every man's portion, each of the 10 generations. He came along and collected all of their reward. And then Rabbeinu Yonah explains how he did this. He says, because whatever bad each person did in that generation, Avram Avinu did good opposite it. And whatever each person didn't accomplish that they were supposed to accomplish, Avram Avinu accomplished. So whatever bad the 10 generations worth of people did, Avram Avinu did good opposite it. And whatever good that they didn't do, Avram Avinu filled in. And here's the tema. How is it possible? Let's say you tell me a man who uses his time wisely, a man who's very efficient. You tell me he could produce as much as 10 men. You tell me that Chazon Ish was such a masmid, he could learn as much as 100 men. I'm not sure how, but maybe. But there's a limit. How is it possible that one man could do the work of an entire generation? If there are thousands upon thousands of men in that generation, and they did bad, and they didn't do good, how is it possible for one man to eradicate their bad and do the good that they were supposed to? But it's not one generation, it's 10 generations. How is it possible that one human being can be the equivalent of 10 generations of people? And as long as you remain in a system of judgment of this world, you will not see an answer to this question. And the only way that you can find an answer to this question is when you step out of this limited reality that we call physicality. And I'll explain to you what I mean. As I stand in front of you, if you can, please. As I stand in front of you, you see a body. You see arms, you see legs, you see a head, you see a face. And that's what you see. But the reality is that this part will be put in the ground, and I will stand in front of Hashem for judgment. But you see, I is not the arms, I is not the legs, I is not the head, and I is not even the brain. I am the person inside. And probably the single greatest mistake that we human beings make is we mistake our present circumstances for reality. We mistake our bodies for ourselves. And as a matter of fact, I'll share with you a common mistake. Most people, when they'll come to shul on Yom Kippur, maybe sometimes on Shabbos, they'll have a spiritual experience. They'll feel the Kedusha of Shabbos. And they'll feel the holiness of Yom Kippur. And it almost feels a little sort of weird. Here I am, this physical entity, having this spiritual experience. And nothing could be further from the truth. I am not a physical being occasionally having spiritual experiences. I am a spiritual entity temporarily having a physical experience. I who think, I who tell my arms and legs to move, I, the guy inside, was under the Kisei HaKavod. Hashem said, this is a generation into which you shall be born, into this body, with this temperament, with this amount of intelligence. This is your life, go lead it. But when I'm done my job here, this part, this shell, the coat, is put in the ground, and I separate. But I'm not the body. I'm not physical. I am utterly, completely, totally spiritual. And this cognition is probably one of the most essential ones that a human being has to come to if they really want to grow. Why? Because once you understand this, you understand life in a vastly different plane. You see, as long as I'm the body, nothing that I do really changes things that much. After all, how much growth can you do? If you eat a lot of food, you could put on 10 pounds, 20 pounds. Keep doing it, you could put on 50 pounds. But it's a very physical, very corporeal, very slow growth process. And any act that I do is just a physical, plain, simple act. I said good morning, I said good night, I did learn, I didn't learn. What difference does it make? And as long as you view yourself as a physical entity, you will not begin to understand who you are, what you can accomplish, and what you're on this world for. And once you understand that I'm not the body, then you could look at life in a vastly different way. I, the one who thinks, am spiritual, which means in plain, simple language, spiritual items are boundless, limitless, and beyond physical descriptions, and can change in ways that we would have difficulty imagining. Meaning to say, once I identify myself as a spiritual entity, I no longer can use physical measurements to measure. It's the difference between TNT and atomic energy. For thousands of years, man has been blowing things up, starting with the Chinese back in the ancient days, moving on to dynamite, moving on to gunpowder. Man has been blowing things up, shooting projectiles, doing all kinds of damage. But life changed in 1945. Reality changed. Because for the first time in human history, an entire city, not just a building, not just a block, entire neighborhoods, entire population, an entire city was obliterated. In a flash of light, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were just leveled, no longer there. And what mankind discovered was that this is a whole new dimension. We're not dealing with the old order. Because I don't care how much TNT you pack into a truck and park under the World Trade Center, you can only blow a crater 60 feet deep. But that's it. But we're not talking about a crater. We're talking about an entire city, miles and miles this way, miles and miles that way, leveled, flattened, no longer in existence. And the measurement system of 1945 is no longer applicable, because once nuclear energy was unleashed and it became more sophisticated and more sophisticated, we're no longer dealing with cities, we're dealing with entire regions. We're dealing with power that can literally level and wreak such havoc that it's beyond human comprehension. But this is the point. It's not the old world order. It's not dynamite. It's not TNT. It's a whole different level. And I'd like to share with you that that is the difference between the body and the soul. The body can do something. It could chop wood. It could build a table. If it works real hard, a human being could build an entire house. Maybe an apartment complex. Look what he built. But that's limited. It's corporeal. It's physical. The I, the one inside, dealing in a totally different dimension. I, the spiritual part, grow and accomplish and can do things. But it's not just that I can do, I change, and I become different. Avram Avinu was a towering giant. If we were attuned to a spiritual level, we'd see a giant, not a little bit bigger than the man next to him, towering over, so much larger and so much overpowering that you couldn't even compare him. So powerful, so huge that he could do the work of 10 generations of people. Because two people can walk one next to another, look the same. One can be a towering, fantastically powerful giant because he grew, he changed, he became what he was supposed to be, and the man next to him wasn't. And with these three levels of measuring, let's go back to Ruvain and Shimon. Ruvain, the fellow who gave the Daf Yomi, and Shimon, the guy who sat there. Ruvain clearly was much better, right? Ruvain knew Shas, clear head, great understanding. Shimon didn't. Ruvain brought together 150 people. My goodness, look at that. His chus, Shimon didn't have it. But there's only one little problem. You have to know who they were. You see, Ruvain, when he grew up, was a brilliant fellow. Learning in yeshiva, he was slated to be a Rosh Hashiva. He was slated to be one of the Gedolei Ador. And at 18 years of age, he said to himself, you know what, I could be a Rosh Hashiva, but I want a fancy house. I want a gorgeous car. I want to be a corporate lawyer so I can make big bucks. And he gave it up. He feels guilty, so he gives the Daf Yomi shir, and he learns, prepares for 2 hours, and gives the shir, but he's not 100th of what he could have been. Shimon, regular guy, learned in yeshiva, wasn't a great Eloi, but he learned and he learned, and he tried, and he's hitting his peak. And what you're looking at, two human beings who look the same, and Ruvain outproduces Shimon, and yet Shimon might be towering over Ruvain by 1,000-fold. But there's another part of the cheshbon that you have to take into account. When Ruvain walks into the room, the honor, the accord, and when his wife shows up in the supermarket, oh, you're Ruvain's wife, the famous Maggid Shir, and he can't help but gloat a little bit when he walks in the room and feel the fact that, yeah, I am the world famous Maggid Shir, and my Daf Yomi is the best attended shir in Brooklyn, and he can't help but gloat, and truth be told, he really is probably more driven by honor than anything else. And what he just did was, he just sucked out the lishma of his act. And if you factor in how difficult it is for him to come to the shir, not difficult at all, he's motivated by a tremendous amount of kavod. And you look at Shimon, Shimon is very, very broken. He gets no honor, sits in the back. It's very difficult for him. And you could be looking at two people and not have a clue to where they're at. To my mind's eye, it looks like Ruvain is steiging, looking at the top of the world, and it could be exactly the opposite. Ruvain could be accomplishing but a fraction of what it could have been. His motivations might be impure. It might be so easy for him because he's getting all of this negative attention, and what he's doing is impure, and it could be devalued by 1,000 times. And Shimon, on the other hand, might be reaching his potential, might be as pure as he can be, might be very, very difficult for him, and his acts could be 1,000 times more valuable. And I think that's what Chazal is telling us, that the system of measuring things in Shemayim is not the system we use here. And you can't tell. You could have a very sophisticated app, count all your mitzvahs, but you'll never tell. There are thousands and thousands of degrees of difference based on how pure, and based on who you are, and based on the circumstances, the context, and there is no app because it's so complex, so vast, and one act could weigh 10,000 times the opposite of another act, even though they look ostensibly on the surface the same. And I believe what the Siforno is telling us is exactly that point. You see, the generation that were born in the Midbar accomplished great things. They learned Shas, but they also had it very easy. There was nothing to do in the Midbar but learn. And not only were there no distractions, you got honor for nothing else other than learning. If you're born into this environment where everyone is learning, and you're given tremendous honor for your learning, and there's nothing in the world that's valuable other than this, well, no kidding, you became the Dardea. But look at the previous generation. The previous generation didn't have it so easy at all. They were born into slavery, and they could barely say Shema. And despite that, they were Makir Hashem. Each of the 10 Makkahs was shown. The Mitzrayim denied them. The Klal Yisrael saw Hashem. And at that moment when they left and they walked through Kriyas Shamsuf, they said, Zekili Vanveu, they reached Har Sinai, and as a unit, as a nation, they reached forth and said, Hashem Hu Elokim. And based on where they were coming from, and based on where they were, they towered over the next generation. Why? Because it was their fight, it was their battle. They made themselves into who they were, and the Siforno is telling us that therefore they were on a totally different level. Granted, the next generation learned Shas and Poskim. You guys were amazing, but it was easy. There was no fight. There was nothing difficult, and therefore it doesn't begin to count for anywhere near what the earlier generation did. And if you think that this is interesting but irrelevant, I believe it's quite relevant. And I'll share with you why. I have now at home 3 daughters. Each of them, Baruch Hashem, are very musical. Each of them take piano lessons, and they've been doing it for many years. And they're very involved in music. They go in school productions and school choirs. They write songs. They're at harmony, and it's very entertaining. And it happens to be Zmiris in the house when we don't have guests. It happens to be beautiful. And it took me a little while to realize that there was one thing that was interesting. The Zmiris are beautiful, and everyone is happy, except when Abba begins to sing. Then there's this like rolling the eyes. I mean, they're polite. They try not to let me know. And it wasn't until, I didn't really notice it, until one of my daughters, when I was making Kiddush, was humming along. I found it strange. And then I found out that every time I sing, she sings along. Why? Because she finds my singing so grating that she has to like drown it out. And I felt like, my goodness, look at these snoots over here. You know what I mean? Who paid for the music lessons? And now you guys are making fun because I don't know the harmonies and I don't know how to transpose. And I felt like an Amoritz. I really did. And I am. I mean, they're very musical and they're very knowledgeable. And here I am, the Amoritz. And I said to myself, that's very interesting. Why? I have seen quite a number of Bali Tshuva who do very well, bring up a family, send their, could you just tell my ADD, I'm sorry, I do apologize. And they send their kids to yeshiva, and by the time the boy is in 6th grade, he knows how to learn better than his father. And when I said that over, by the way, to someone, I wrote it in one of the Shmuz on a parsha, the woman who edits it is a Baal Tshuva, she said it's not true. She said, when my daughter was 6 years old, she read Hebrew better than I did. It's not until the boy is in 6th grade, and my daughter was reading better than me in 6th grade. And sometimes there's an interesting phenomenon that comes about. You get kids who are a little snobby. My dad's a good guy, but come on, what does he know? I'm in 8th grade, I'm in 10th grade, I'm learning Ksos, I'm learning Mashaz. And my father, nice guy, is an Amoritz. How can I respect my father? And I think this Siforno, if for nothing else, just to address this single point, your Shas and Poskim is very impressive, but you went to a yeshiva. Your social environment was such that all you did was get honor for your learning. And what you were driven to and what you were constantly involved in was learning. Did you excel? Yes. Is it impressive? Yes. But how much of a fight was it? Did you go from 0 to 60? And did you pick yourself up from the absolute bottom and say this is emes when you not only didn't have to, but everything was fighting against it? Did you bring yourself up? You were born into it like the Dardea, and you were born in the Midbar, and how much of a fight is it? How much did you accomplish? How much did you change your nature? How much did you fight? And it could well be that your Shas and Poskim is impressive, but it also could be that your father's Chumash and Rashi far outweighs it. And that's an important perspective. And I think it's an important point to think about. But I think there's a far more significant point for us to realize from this. And that is, every once in a while, you may get the sense of, how pure are my acts? After all, if an act done with purity could be worth 1,000 times more, and an act done with impurity could be 1,000 times less, who's to say that my acts are so pure? And I remember very vividly when I was in the Yeshivas at Sal's Blatchier, I had a certain point where I had a frum streak in me, and I came into the Yeshiva and said, Rebbe, I need help. What's up? I feel I'm not learning Lishma. What do you mean? I'm learning to be the best guy in the bloodshed. I want to be the best guy in the bloodshed. That's my focus. I'm not learning the Shema. The Shiva said, good. I said, Rebbe, I should understand. I feel I'm not learning Lishma. I'm learning to be the best guy in the bloodshed. It's not Lishma. The Shiva said, good. I said, no, you should understand. I'm not learning Lishma. I'm learning to be the best guy in the Shir. I'm not learning Lishma. The Shiva said, good. I said, what do you mean good? He said, great. What do you mean? If you were learning Lishma, you'd sleep till 12 o'clock. The only one who wants you to learn Lishma is the Sultan. Why? Because if you're going to learn Lishma, you're not going to get out of bed in the morning. Learn not Lishma. Learn for the sake of being the best guy in Blotshire, and you'll grow, you'll accomplish, you'll reach heights. And what the Rishiva was saying was a very profound concept. And that is that if you use a low Lishma motivation to get you to serve Hashem, that's holy. Meaning to say, no one's learning for kavod. I'm not going to make a lot of money if I'm the best guy in the blotshire, but using that as a motivational system. I want to learn because it's Hashem's Torah. I want to learn because this is what Hashem wants of me, but I need something to get me moving. So I'm going to use this thing called kavod. I'm setting my goal. I'm going to be the best guy in the shir. And I'm using that as a tool for Lishma that is a very holy and proper thing. If used properly, it's Kaddish. Used properly, it's holy. Used properly, it propels a person to tremendous heights. And this concept should be used in every activity that we do. If you have a lot of money and you're zocheh to give tzedakah, and it's known, it's fine and well, as long as you use that as a way to get you to give more. If you're a big Baal Chesed and you do things, but it's known, and you're aware of it, and we're all subject to acting differently when people scrutinize us, but I'm not impure because I'm using that to motivate myself, I'm using that to drive myself, and it's a very holy and proper thing because I'm using a lo lishma to serve Hashem better, and I'm using it as a motivational system, and it doesn't count as impure. It'll bring me closer and closer, and it's not something that's impure, it's something very kaddish. And I think what the Siforno is telling us is a tremendous yesod. You could look at two human beings and not have a clue. Much like that woman who called me up and I had her pegged as taking revenge against me, and I was so far off base. Nebuch, the poor woman, was being driven to her husband's levaya. I could not have been more off. When we look at other human beings, we don't have a clue. We don't know where they're coming from. We don't know their potential. We don't know what a fight there is. And what the Siforno is telling us is that unlike the physical is judged on a very simplistic and very formulaic manner. Was he guilty? Was he aware of the consequences? Was he mazed? If he knew what he was doing, he's chayav. It's an on or off switch, guilty or innocent. But the din in Shemayim is way, way more complex, way, way more intricate. And question number one is, how much of your potential were you reaching? How easy was it for you? How difficult? How much of a fight? And that can make thousands of degrees of difference. Was it easy? Was it simple? You did an Aveira. Was it a major Nisayan, in which case the punishment is very light? Or was it easy for you, but you just said, I don't care? Thousands of degrees of difference in punishment, thousands of degrees of difference in reward. How pure? A pure act done l'shem shamayim can be thousands of times more valuable than one done not l'shem shamayim. And finally, who are you? If you spend years growing, accomplishing, changing, you're not a little bit bigger than the guy next to you. You could be towering over. And you could be a giant. You could be a giant of the spirit reaching tremendous heights, as an Avram Avinu who could accomplish what 10 generations couldn't. And when we judge other people, we don't have a clue. One man's Chumash and Rashi may be 1,000 times more valuable than another man's Rashbas and Rishonim, and we don't have a clue. And I want to close with one last observation in this sugya. It's a well-known story, but I think now you'll understand the story a little bit deeper. The Satmar Rav was a manhig b'Yisrael. And certainly to his Hasidim, he was their link, he was their attachment, and he was older, he was sick, and it was clear that he was not going to be there that much longer. And some of his Hasidim said to him, Rebbe, what's going to be? When you leave us, who are we going to go to for a bracha? And the Satmar Rebbe said, you go to shul. Find a man who, when he takes off his tefillin, and you see the concentration camp numbers on his arm, ask that man for a bracha. What was the Satmar Rebbe saying? The man could be an Amoritz D'Oraisa. The man could barely read Chumash. Man may know, I'm going to get a bracha from him, and it's a bracha like Kafi the Satmar Rebbe. The Satmar Rebbe was saying was, if that man went through Gehenim and he's he's still Yerushalayim, and despite that he sees Hashem, that's holy, that's great. Come on, that's a great man. That's a Kaddish. He's a Talmid Chacham. And I think this is exactly the answer. There are many, many systems of measurement, many factors that determine. It's not din here. It's hugely complex. And when you see a man who went through that and is still from, you're looking at a Malach Elokim, and that man can give brachas. And I think it's a concept for us to contemplate, think about, and try to put into action. May Hashem grant us the wisdom to embody this and use this effectively.